See, I remembered it myself today. Pat myself on the back. All right. We've got a little bit of a busy day, so we're going to kind of jump into it. First off, I had all meetings with all of you individually. I think we're all kind of in the process of kind of narrowing our question, focusing on our question, finding some readings. So remember, tomorrow I'm going to ask that you send me your paper proposal, right? Which should have 3 things in it. It should have a statement of your question. It should have a very brief summary of the articles that you plan to review. And it should have a brief summary of how these articles fit together, okay? And so, as I said, it doesn't have to be really more than a page, right? It's certainly no more than 2 pages. A very brief summary. Send this to me tomorrow, let's say, by noon tomorrow, okay? Just kind of an arbitrary time. So you can have some time to work on it in the morning, but send this to me. My plan is that tomorrow I will get this back to you. Actually, what am I thinking? You guys are taking your exam tomorrow. So how about, back up. It's not due till Friday. So let's say noon on Friday, not tomorrow, noon on Friday. You have to send this to me. And then my plan is that I will take a look at it pretty quickly and get it back to you with some feedback. And so that is kind of the green light to start, doing some more, more substantive work on your paper. Okay, so that's due on Friday. Tomorrow we have our exam. And so I'm going to save a lot of time this afternoon for reviewing for the exam. And basically by reviewing, I mean, if you have some questions you want to go over, I'm happy to spend time going over questions this afternoon. Let me just talk really briefly about the exam, though, just so we're all kind of on the same page about what's going to go on tomorrow. So all we're going to do tomorrow is the exam. Okay, that's the only thing we're doing. I'm going to give you 3 hours for the exam. So I'm going to send it to you at 9 a.m. and you have to send it back to me by noon. I think that should be plenty of time to take the exam, right? I think that really should be plenty of time to take the exam. So I'm going to send you a Word file, and what you need to send me back is a Word file, right? So everything needs to be in this Word file, including if you draw some graphs on a piece of paper, that's just fine to take a picture of them, but you need to put it into the Word file, right? So if you as I said, if you want to draw graphs just on a piece of paper, or if there's anything you want to write on a piece of paper, just take a picture of it, put it in the Word file, send the Word file to me, because that is what I'm going to grade, okay? So I'm giving you 3 hours to do that tomorrow. And as I said, I really think that should be enough time. The exam is really just going to be, the exam is going to be worth 125 points, right? So it's going to be, basically a mix of short answers and some short essays, right? There's going to be a mix of questions that kind of ask more technical questions about, for instance, how the Solow model works and what the implications of the Solow model is, maybe comparing and contrasting the Solow model to the Romer model, or the Romer model to the Lucas model of human capital that we talked about. So there's going to be some questions that are kind of more detail focused about the models. And then there's going to be some questions that are more, as I said, kind of short essay questions, asking you to kind of think more broadly about some of the questions that we've talked about here in this class. So so it's going to be a mix. It's going to be a mix. And in general, while it's hard to do this perfectly, I want the exam to generally reflect the amount of time that we spent on a topic in class, okay? So in other words, I'm not going to, half of the exam is not going to be on the Lucas model of human capital, right? So, I try as, obviously the Solow model is going to be a really important part of what's going to be on this exam, because we spent the better part of last week talking about that, right? Certainly institutions, what we spent the last couple of days is going to be a bigger part of the exam. But then, you know, I'm going to try to touch on all the things that we talked about this week, whether it's the Romer or these first 2 weeks, whether it's the Romer model, whether it's the role of education in growth, some of the empirical data that we've talked about growth. Okay. So the exam tomorrow is basically on everything that we've talked to up to this point in class, including today's lecture, okay? So basically everything that we've talked about through today is basically fair game, right? It's basically fair game. So, you know, I'm happy to answer more questions or to talk in more detail about the exam. Anybody have any questions about the exam right now? They want to ask? Okay, so, and let me just say one thing about the exam. By making the exam 3 hours, I really don't think that time should be a big constraining factor if you're prepared for the exam, okay? And by that I mean, you know, if you're not prepared and you have to look through your notes for everything, then yeah, time might be an issue for you. But I think if you've been keeping up and doing the readings and doing the work, I really think that 3 hours should be a pretty good amount of time to do this. So I'm not saying that you'll have a ton of extra time. Some of you might have some extra time, but you know, I think most of you won't have a problem in finishing comfortably. At least that's my hope. So in many ways, I have to say this midterm is almost kind of like the final in the sense that after today, we still will cover new material, but the amount of new material that we're going to cover in this class is going to start to go down, right? That we've really kind of covered what I consider to be the core of the course. And so after this, we're going to kind of talk about some smaller issues related to growth and kind of some more, how should I say, ancillary topics related to growth. And then, you know, obviously we're going to begin thinking a lot about your papers, right? And so maybe having a little bit less class time and a little bit more time for you to think and write, and then also to meet with me individually as you need it. So anyway, congratulations, right? You've almost got through the hardest part of the course, right? At least the most material intensive part of the class. So, okay, any other questions about anything before we go on here and talk about institutions? Okay, well, today, we're going to talk about institutions some more. Today's the Acemoglu Day, right? We're going to talk about 2 readings from Acemoglu and Johnson, just to give you a little bit of idea of who these people are. Daron Acemoglu is a professor of economics at MIT. Probably, I mean, I'm sure some people would disagree, but certainly one of the biggest names in economics today. Done some really interesting work on economic growth. And of course, that's how we know him, but he's done a lot of interesting work on a bunch of other interesting things. Simon Johnson, who's his co-author on both of these, is actually a political scientist. And so one of the interesting things about both of these papers is that they actually bring, I would call both of these papers more of a political economy sort of research, in that it's really fusing the role of economics and the role of politics in helping us understand what's going on. And of course, institutions are, you know, a classic example of a topic that needs a political economy perspective, right? Because almost every one of these economic incentives is shaped by a political process in many ways. And so, so those are two of the authors. I'm not as familiar with Robinson's work, who's in this colonial origins paper, but I believe he's an economist at Harvard. So the first paper that we're going to talk about is, let's begin by talking about the colonial origins of comparative development, okay? This is, I believe, in terms of citations, the second most cited paper in economics in the last 20 years, okay? So this is a widely cited paper among economists, in many ways because the results are surprising, and in many ways because it's clever. And economists love to cite papers that are clever, love to cite papers that are surprising, and also because I think the applications of this, not just in terms of growth, but in thinking about a whole range of issues related to economic history and the politics, is really important. So, the colonial origins of comparative development. So, what's the question, right? Remember, we talked last week about when you read a paper like this, you really need to have a question. Well, I should say there really should be the 4-step process, right? Where what's the question? Okay. Step 1 is to make sure you know what the question is. Step 2 is to think about the model and the data. Step 3 is to summarize the key results. And step 4 is to talk about, well, why does this matter? So let's do that here. Sorry. Okay. Okay. What's the question? Anybody want to help me out on this? What's the question that the authors are interested in this paper?
It's asking about why there are large fundamental differences in income across countries.
Right, right. So, and specifically the role that institutions play in that, right? So just to kind of rephrase that a little bit, how do we empirically identify the importance of institutions? In explaining income differences across countries. How do we empirically identify the importance of institutions in explaining income differences across countries? Okay, so think of it this way. Suppose that you had a model and you were looking at, for instance, growth across countries. And you tried to estimate it like this. You tried to use a simple empirical model. Do institutions impact growth? Yeah, right? That's what this model is saying. Institutions are a predictor of growth. But what's the problem if you estimate this model? The problem is we have a problem of simultaneity bias. In the fact that institutions impact growth, but it's also a problem that growth impacts institutions, right? Does being richer change institutions? Almost undoubtedly it does, right? So the more that you're rich, the more you can possibly spend on creating democratic institutions, spending more money on legal systems, more money on property rights and crime enforcement. There's a whole range of things that we could think about that you can afford to spend on and improve your institutions if you have the money. And so if I go up and estimate this this equation, do I have any confidence in my results? No, I can't have any confidence. There's no way for me to separate the impact of institutions on growth and the impact of growth on institutions. So this is not really a model that we can buy, right? It's not a model that we can trust. So there is a solution though. Finding an instrumental variable, right? An instrumental variable is something that is correlated with institutions, but not affected by growth. It is, for those of you who are familiar with the word, a proxy, right? A proxy. It's something that's closely correlated with institutions, but it's not influenced by growth. So the authors say, well, listen, if I could find an instrumental variable, then what could I do? I could go back and estimate this equation. Now, does the instrumental variable replaces institutions, right? The instrumental variable replaces institutions. Now, this, because it's correlated with institutions, I can see how it impacts growth. But the nice thing is I don't have to worry about how growth could impact this instrumental variable. That allows me, excuse me, it allows us to get a blue estimate of beta 1, if you remember that terminology. Blue meaning best estimator of beta 1. So the authors are interested in the impact of institutions on growth, and how do you do that empirically, right? How do you identify that empirically? Recognizing that we typically have a big simultaneity bias, right? So as we're going to talk about, they actually do this, but they run a model where they say, okay, let's say that institutions can be measured by corruption, right? So growth is a function of corruption. They show those results, but what they're going to say is we can't trust them, because does corruption impact growth? Yes, but does growth impact corruption? Almost certainly, right? We can't trust it. We can't trust it. So what we need to do is find an instrumental variable. So step 2, when we talk about the model and the data, what is our instrumental variable? What is the variable that's correlated with institutions, but is not impacted by today's growth? And so what's clever about this paper is the idea that Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson have for an instrumental variable, and that is the mortality rates of colonizers. They argue that the mortality rates of colonizers are closely associated with today's institutions. We can use that as a proxy for growth. But the nice thing is, does growth today impact how many colonizers died in the 1800s? Of course not, right? We don't have to worry about that simultaneity bias here. Now, of course, the question for us is why? Why? Particularly, I think the why question is, why should colonizer mortality be associated with today's institutions? Right? Why should we believe that this is a good instrumental variable? And so what Acemoglu and the other authors do here is they actually walk us through history a little bit. And so let's talk about that history, because one of the things that is clear from a detailed history of colonization across the globe is that colonization was not the same everywhere, right? The practices of colonization differed radically from place to place. Sometimes the policies were quite extractive. Sometimes we had extractive settlements versus, maybe I'll say it this way. Permanent settlements, right? So the classic example of an extractive settlement was the Congo. You read a little bit about the Congo in the second article, the chapter from the book, right? The Congo has one of the most sad histories of colonization, if not the most sad history of colonization in the world, right? I mean, basically, at one point in time, the entire country of the Congo was owned by one person, King Leopold of Belgium. One person owned the entire place and basically ran it as a slave camp, right? Basically ran it as a slave camp. First to get ivory and rubber, first to get ivory and then to get rubber, right? People were regularly mutilated, murdered, right? Sold into slavery. You are all probably familiar with Joseph Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness, right? The Heart of Darkness was written after Joseph Conrad visited the Congo during this period of time, right? For those who are interested in the history of Congo, I think this sounds like an interesting topic. There's a really good book called King Leopold's Ghost that I would recommend to you that kind of walks through the history of the very sad history of the Congo. But it was in a completely extractive settlement. Why? Well, the argument to be made, and this is actually an argument, if you remember from Heart of Darkness, that Conrad makes the same argument, is every white person who went to the Congo knew that they were on borrowed time. They knew that the longer they stayed there, they were going to die. And so what incentives did that create for colonizers? It created an incentive to go get in, take what you can, and get out, right? So the extractive settlement was often associated with disease, right? Disease. It reduced the feasibility of settlement. And as a result, it led to more extractive institutions being set up, right? In other words, instead of focusing on making, the whole focus was on taking. Take as fast as you can. What tended to be true about countries that had extractive settlements? These tended to be in the tropics. Why? Because of diseases like yellow fever that most Europeans lacked genetic immunity from. But not every colony was set up like this, right? For every Congo, well, not for every Congo, but sometimes you had places like North America, which of course had its own set of diseases, but they were not nearly as daunting as what we saw in most of the tropics. And so what did we tend to see in these permanent settlements? We tended to see farming, right? People came to settle. They often brought their family. No colonists that went to Congo brought their wife and kids, right? That did not happen, right? But many settlers in North America and other places like Australia and New Zealand, right? Places that were more temperate, right? Often brought their family to stay. And if you're going to stay in a place, what did you do? You spent the time to create quality institutions that focused on making as opposed to taking. So the first point that the authors want to make, which I don't think is really refutable, is that there were different colonization strategies followed in different parts of the world, depending upon how likely a colonizer was to really stay there. But there's a second part to their argument. It's not just that there were different strategies, but then they also make the argument that institutions are persistent. In other words, there's a path dependence. The institutions of the past still influence our institutions of today. So in things such as in the countries that had extractive colonies, you still see today that in those countries where forced labor was common, even today in many of those countries, forced labor still remains prevalent. They still have dictators. The difference now is that those dictators are black, they're not white, but they follow many of the same policies. So as you learned about in your reading, right, what happened when the Belgians and other Europeans left the Congo? Well, they were replaced by Mobutu, who in many ways was just as bad, right? Was just as bad. It followed the same sort of forced labor policies, the same sort of corruption, the same disinterest in actually building a country, right? There's that famous quote from Mugabe where, what was it, in the Congo? The Congo is roughly about the size of, I believe, like Alaska. You know, it's bigger than it's a big country. During Mobutu's era, they only had about 500 kilometers of roads in the entire country. And somebody asked, why don't you spend more time on building roads? And he says, you build a road and one day people use the road to come and get you. So that tells you everything you need to know about the leadership of Mugabe. And then there were other, you know, for every Congo, there were many other countries in Africa that had similar sorts of stories, like Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. In South America, you had Perón in Argentina, who his own version of kind of the big man dictator. And so, you know, so because of this, because institutions are slow to change, the past really matters. the past matters. And so the authors collect data on settler mortality. So this is settler mortality of soldiers, bishops, and sailors. There's about 200 years worth of data. And the data is expressed as deaths per 1,000 with replacement. Okay, what does that mean? This is a bit of a confusing way of expressing it. So this is how many people would die to maintain 1,000 settlers for a year. How many people are going to die to maintain 1,000 settlers for a year? So if you look at the table at the end of your paper, I don't know if any of you did this, but these are kind of some shocking numbers. When you actually look at the mortality rates, so here's table A2. So this is looking at the data mortality. So look at, for instance, Nigeria here. Nigeria, if you can see that. Their mortality estimate is 2004. What does that mean? To keep 1,000 settlers in Nigeria for a year, it was going to be associated with 2,000 deaths, right? That is one hell of a mortality rate. That is one hell of a mortality rate. It's telling you that on average, people were not lasting half a year in Nigeria, right? That within 4 or 5 months, they were dead. And so what's your incentive if you're going to Nigeria? You're trying to get some money and get the hell out of there, right? And, you know, that's the way it was. And you can see some really huge numbers. Mali, right? Almost 3,000 people have to die to keep 1,000 settlers there. Gambia, right? 1470. You know, even, and some of these numbers are much lower, but still really, really high. Colombia, 240 people die to keep 1,000 settlers. So these are, you know, these are not like marginal rates. I mean, let's put it this way. It's a lot scarier than COVID. I am not diminishing COVID, but listen, COVID's got nothing on yellow fever, particularly when you don't have any sort of antibiotics and really any sort of public health or whatever. And it's extremely dangerous. So, actually, why did I do that? So, one of the things the authors show in in figure 1, I can find this, is they actually plot out the log of settler mortality and the log of per capita GDP. And we do see a strong negative correlation between what settler mortality was in these countries and how rich the country is today. Of course, this graph by itself doesn't prove anything, right? Because there could be admitted variables here. You know, we're just looking at one thing. We're just saying, does settler mortality cause the log of per capita GDP? Well, there's a correlation, but we don't know about the causation, right? We don't know about the causation. So to get the causation, we really have to do regression analysis, okay? And so that's where the authors move to next. So step 3 is the results. Okay. So first, they actually estimate the wrong model, right? So in other words, they look at, I think they express it like this. They look and see how today's institutions relate to the log of Y, how rich a country is. And what do they find? So if we use expropriation, or expropriation is corruption, right? A corruption index. If we use today's corruption index, we find that it is a significant predictor. Oh, that should not be a positive though. Sorry. It's negative, right? More corruption reduces growth. That's all fine and good, but the problem here as we talked about, is simultaneity bias. We can't trust these results. So if you use something like corruption index as a measure of institutions, yeah, they do appear to impact today's income level, but we can't trust that. So they say, here's the model that we really should do. Well, actually, this is not the model they really should do, but here's another model. Let's say okay, R here is current institutions. Can you guys hear the chaos that's going on in my house, by the way? Okay, good, good. Somebody is getting their ass chewed out, and I'm glad it's not me. Yeah, I think there's two boys that are in some hot water out there. I'm afraid to open the door and see what the hell they did. Okay, so so let's say that today R is today's institutions measured by the corruption index, and M is settler mortality. Is settler mortality correlated with corruption today? In other words, did countries that have more mortality have more corruption today? So this is the second part, right? Does yesterday's institutions impact today's institutions? So this is from table 3 of your book. You know, I wish that economists could all agree upon how they would present their empirical results, because it really would make things easier on us. And, you know, I think as you have, those of you like look through your papers have looked through them, you'll see that different economists present results in wildly different ways, right? Which is really quite frustrating. But we do what we can. Okay, so where's table 3? Where can I find it here? Here we go, table 3. So this is saying that the dependent variable is the protection against expropriation risk, or our corruption measure. That's the dependent variable. And then here are different kinds of explanatory variables we can include in our model. But the one we're most interested in here is settler mortality. And you see how settler mortality is significantly negative, right? Meaning that it is worsening institutions. And it's also significant. In parentheses, these are the standard deviation, right? So remember what your t-statistic is. If you take the coefficient and you divide by the standard deviation and it's greater than 2, then it's statistically significant. So yes, this is statistically significant. Why does your author do this in different ways? Well, as we're going to talk about, a lot of this paper is robustness testing, right? Let's set up the model in different ways and include different kinds of measures or different control variables. You know, do different models. Do we get different results? And you know, as we'll talk a little bit later, one of the things we find consistently is that settler mortality is a significant predictor of today's institutions. All right, now we get to the question that we're really interested in, right? The next regression that they do is the one that we're really interested in, right? Is the log of income, and in other words, is today's income impacted by settler mortality? Right, so income today is a function of settler mortality, and then X is just other control variables. This is the model that they think makes the most sense, right? Because this is hopefully controlling for simultaneity bias. And so the results are in table 4. Once again, these are complicated graphs. Let's mainly look here in panel B. And so our dependent variable up here is log of per capita GDP. And then this is the model. All of the models include the log of settler mortality, but then they use other control variables such as the latitude, or whether it's in Asia, or when it's in Africa, or you know, they try a bunch of different specifications. But the key thing here is notice that in every case, right, settler mortality has a negative and significant impact on today's income level. So in every case, right, in every case, we're seeing that settler mortality is negative and significant. Now that's statistical significance. That's statistical significance. But we're also interested in economic significance, meaning, okay, so there's an effect. Is the effect large? And so what your authors do is they actually say, well, compare two countries. Pick Nigeria and Chile. Nigeria had very high settler mortality, and Chile had relatively low settler mortality. This model would predict that settler mortality would make Chile 7 times richer than Nigeria. Settler mortality alone would make Chile 7 times richer than Nigeria. That is a big effect, right? In fact, Chile is about 15 times bigger than or richer than Nigeria. So in other words, settler mortality explains about half of the income difference between those two countries. And that's a result that they find in many places, that settler mortality is explaining a huge amount, right, of the differences in income between countries. And so that's one of the reasons why this paper is so widely cited, right? It's not just that it's clever. It's not just that they find a result, but it's that that result is economically significant, right? It appears to be very, very important. The rest of the results, and I think, you know, once again, this is going to be true of most of the papers that you talk about. You want to summarize the main results, but you don't want to get into all of the results, right? You really don't. And so in this paper, you know, the rest of the tables are, and really the rest of the paper is they test how robust the results are. They keep on adding a bunch of different variables to their model to see if anything changes, right? They add like a British, was it the British or the French? That was the colonizers. Does that make a difference? No. They look at things like latitude, meaning the fact that you're just in the tropics alone, does that make a difference? Not really. They look at temperature. Does being in a hot place matter? It doesn't matter over and above settler mortality, right? Settler mortality is the important thing, not just temperature itself. They look at things like soil quality, whether the country is landlocked or whether it had access to the sea, how diverse the country is in terms of ethnic diversity, and a few other things. I'm not going to go into all of them. The key here whether you add these things or not, they do not significantly impact the role of settler mortality on income levels. Okay. So, step 4. The summary. I think it's pretty obvious. History matters. That's really what Acemoglu and his co-authors are trying to tell us. History matters. There is this phenomenon of path dependence, particularly when it comes to institutions. So what has happened in the past matters today. And that doesn't just matter for the Congo, but it matters, you know, in places like the United States, where we know that there have been people that have been systematically discriminated against, right? And so when you hear people saying, well, that was the past, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, well, it's not that simple, right? Because institutions have this path dependency, right? And when people are excluded from institutions, when they're excluded from wealth, when they're excluded from financial systems, right, that has long-lasting effects. And so this is part of the reason why we have poverty traps and virtuous circles. Countries with good institutions grow, and as they grow, they get better institutions. Countries with poor institutions don't grow, and then their institutions worsen, and that worsens growth. One thing that this paper can't really explain for us is it has something to say about where bad institutions come from, but it doesn't really have a lot to say about where good institutions come from, right? So, okay, so people wanted to settle in North America, and so they wanted good institutions. How do you go about creating good institutions, right? How do you go about creating good institutions? Well, this is really the second article that I sent you, Breaking the Mold, in which the authors kind of basically look at case studies and trying to figure out where do good institutions come from, right? And what we're going to see here is that it's messy. There's not some sort of simple formula for creating good institutions. But before we get into all that, why don't we take a break here, okay? So anyway, that's the first article that we've talked about, the colonial origins article. So let's take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about the breaking the mold chapter. Okay, so let's meet back here at 10 o'clock, right? All right, have a good break. All right, welcome back, everyone. All right, we all popping back in here? I think so, hopefully. Okay, so get my thing up. Okay, so to pick up where we left off before break, what makes for good institutions, right? What makes for good institutions? So this is the second reading I gave you is from a book by Acemoglu and Johnson called Why Nations Fail, which a book I actually highly recommend. It's almost a beach read in the sense that it is not a technical book. The authors really try to make more of a historical argument because they actually recognize that good institutions are really, there's no simple formula for where good institutions come from and how do you change your institutions. So the theme of this book is that institutions matter. But there's no simple formula. But there's no simple formula for creating good institutions. There's no simple formula. But in this chapter of Breaking the Mold, the authors talk about 4 case studies of countries that either have had very good institutions, or countries that have had very bad institutions, or countries that have had both, right? And so, the story is try to kind of figure out through some historical perspective what we can say about countries that have good institutions or not. I'm actually not going to talk about all of these case studies. I think, this is an easy book to understand. I think you can read this for yourself. I do, though, want to talk about one of these case studies in particular because it's a place that I lived for a while and very fascinating place to me, place I enjoy talking about, place I would love to be today if I could, and that's Botswana. And so let's spend a little bit more time here on the Botswana case study. Just to make sure that we can pick out the most important things about why some countries work and other countries don't, okay? So, Botswana. I have a little bit of a slideshow here. Hopefully this works. Okay. Oh, where's this crazy music coming from? Hold on. This is not what I want. Damn it. How do you turn off the music? Let's try this. All right. Hold on. In the world. Anybody know how to turn off the music on these stupid things? When I did the slideshow earlier, it did not play music. Jeez.
You could,
on our screen, there's a volume
yeah.
bar.
Yeah, okay,
Turn
maybe
the
that will
volume
work.
down.
Maybe that will work. All right. Hold on 1 minute. I've not had any luck with my slideshows that I put together. This block. Okay, let's try it this way. Okay, are you seeing this map? Okay, good. So, so here's Botswana, all right? Botswana is in southern sub-Saharan Africa. It's a landlocked country, right? So there is no ocean border. It's right here in the middle of north of South Africa, between Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Angola, and Zambia a little bit. And so Botswana is about the size of Texas, to give you some perspective, but it only has about 3 million people. So it's the size of Texas, but it has about the population of Iowa. You have probably all seen Botswana in some way, shape, or form if you ever watched National Geographic, right? Because most of Botswana is the Kalahari Desert. And so it's kind of a famous place to go see leopards and cheetahs and elephants. And in fact, next to cattle rearing, the biggest industry in Botswana is tourism, right? Only 4% of the land in Botswana is arable, meaning only about 4% of it can actually be farmed. So the country is a semi-arid desert, and I'll show you some pictures of it here in a minute. The people who live here in Botswana, well, there are a mix of people, including the San people, who are descendants of ancient hunter-gatherers, right? So there are people who still live as hunter-gatherers in Botswana, but most of the population is Swana people, right? Tswana, which I think they talk about in the book. And Swana people are really quite common throughout Southern Africa. It's one of the larger ethnic populations throughout South Africa. Many Swana people speak Swahili in Southern Africa, but in Botswana, they actually speak a language called Swana, which is, as I understand it, vaguely related to Swahili, but it's fairly different. So to just kind of see what the country looks like, why is this not going in order? Okay. Here's another map. Here's another map of Setswana. I don't know if this is particularly interesting to you. You see here, the main center of the country is just a big national park, the Central Kalahari National Park. So this is what a lot of Botswana looks like. It's a semi-arid desert. So it's yeah, I mean, you can graze cattle in it, but there's not really a lot else that you can do. And so most Swana people traditionally raise cattle, right? And that's still a very important part of the culture, right? In fact, when I was at the University of Botswana, the guy next to me was a professor of economics, but every weekend he'd go back to his village and I'd ask him, what did you do this weekend? He said, I looked at my cattle. That's kind of the way of life, right? Of raising cattle, looking at your cattle, right? A kind of a relatively slow pace of life. I was with a few students. Here's our guide who's standing on the camp. This guy was really cool. You can't see from this picture. He had a huge scrape across the side of his face. And after I got to know him a little bit, I said, where'd you get that scrape? And he said, well, I was giving doing a walking tour, and a leopard jumped out of a tree and tried to kill me, and I killed it with my knife. And so, I tended to listen to what this guy said after he told me that he killed a leopard with a knife. It's a beautiful place, right? It is an absolutely stunning place. So I got to give you the National Geographic tour here of some of the stuff you get to see when you go to Botswana, right? Rhinos. As you learn from the readings, because Botswana is a relatively stable and well-run place, it is one of the best nature sanctuaries in the world, right? In fact, one of the problems, probably the biggest problem now in Botswana, is they have a real controversy about elephants, because while most elephants are dying in the rest of Africa, in Botswana, it's one of the few places where the elephant population is growing. And, elephants don't make very good neighbors. And so there's actually this real controversy about what are they going to do with elephants when people have had, elephants come in and sit on their houses, elephants come in and sit on their cars, driving at night. It's a real danger because you can't see the elephant standing on the road. So that might sound like a small potato problem relative to some of our problems, but it's a real problem in Botswana. Right, there's another elephant, right? That looks really close. I don't think I was quite that close, but you get lions, right? See signs like this, right, of hippos and crocodiles. The northern part there's a wild dog. Those are cool. The northern part of Botswana has what's called the Okavango Delta, which is kind of like a river, but it's more of like a delta. It's let me put it this way. The Okavango River dies in the middle of the Kalahari. So where it dies, it kind of dies in this big delta. And so you can take, these are called makoros, which are basically canoes, very flat bottom canoes. And you can travel through this and see, all sorts of wildlife, right? There's me trying to do this. Of course, I was disastrous at it. These are mopani worms. These are a common form of protein, right? So a lot of people eat mopani worms, right? We have the famous, what do you call these kind of trees? God, forgetting of them now. Can't even the name, but anyway. So it's a very beautiful place. A lot of traditional work that goes on, informal work, right? So a big part of the economy is still informal production, right? These are women making baskets, reed baskets, which was a very popular gift or kind of a popular souvenir that people buy, or they don't buy for souvenirs, they actually just use them. Here's basically a drying meat, right? A lot of people, as is true in most countries where there's a fair amount of poverty, have to be kind of jack of all trades, right? So here's investments, security, private investigations, undercover protection, and UPS, right? Which I always thought was funny. You kind of have to be a master of all trade. And that, of course, is one of the traps that keeps a lot of poor people poor. Is when you're poor, you have to be able to do a lot of things. But of course, when you do a lot of things, you can't do any one thing well. And so the lack of specialization, in part because of the fear of the risk of being specialized, is one of the things that tends to keep poor countries poor. And you see that, right? That many people often have multiple jobs, right? Here's a investment, shoe repair, car wash, okay? So once again, just kind of doing a little bit of everything. You know, here's a example of a kind of a traditional little store. Here's a town in Botswana, right? Just to give you a feel for it, like what the country looks like. Here's like little sheds or little, you know, this is kind of how most of the population lives. Very informal living. Another one of those trees, which I can't think of the name of, Baobab trees, right? I think Baobab actually means in Swana upside down, right? Because the tree looks like the roots are growing up. Right, a rondavel, which is kind of a round thatch roof hut, common there. Here's your donkey cart with the back of a back of a station wagon on it. Innovation at work. Once again, here's some kind of informal street vendors, right? A lot of people do kind of informal street vendors, whether it's food or cell phone minutes or things like that. Right, a lot of people, labor-intensive work is still very common there, right? It's not uncommon to see women, instead of having street sweepers, you have women out there with their handmade brooms. So this is Parliament of Botswana. Okay, so you can see what Parliament looks like. So as we know from our reading, Botswana is the longest continuous democracy in Africa. And still, as of today, there's only 3 countries in Africa that have had, I think that's true, maybe that's gone up, but as of a few years ago, there were only 3 African countries that had had a peaceful, nonviolent transition in terms of power in Africa. Here's the inside of Parliament, just so in case you're interested. Here's Seretse Khama, who we're going to talk about here in a couple of minutes. This is the first president of Botswana, and in many ways, the person, you know, to the extent that one person can be responsible for a country being basically a livable place, this is Seretse Khama. We'll talk about him in a moment. Here's the 3 kings, right? We'll talk about the 3 kings in a moment. But these are the 3 kings that, in some sense, set Botswana on a different path than its neighbor countries. And then, you know, examples of institutions working, right? I always like this sign, now Botswana can say it, don't talk to me, talk to my lawyer, right? Well, that's an example of productive institutions, right? Don't solve it yourself, have your lawyer solve it, right? That's what happens in rich countries, right? Don't go and shoot the guy. Why don't you sue him, right? That's actually a positive thing, not a negative thing. Botswana has relatively low corruption, which is surprising because, as we're going to talk about, it is a resource-intensive country, diamonds. And so most resource-intensive countries have a very big problem with corruption. Botswana is an exception, and we'll talk about why that is here in a minute. Botswana, you know, is not all perfect heaven. You know, one of the things that has traditionally been a really big problem in Botswana, less today because of the HIV cocktail, but AIDS. Right, AIDS in the 1990s and early 2000s, Botswana had the highest incidence of AIDS in the world, and so, you know, that was a really big public works, is trying to get people to use more condoms. But, you know, it was not uncommon. Just there were street vendors selling funeral plans, right? As morbid as that seems, right? They lost a very big portion of their population because of AIDS, right? And so that is one of the things that has really been a trouble. This was kind of cool for me. So this is the second president of Africa, Kwet Masare. And so I met him in 2016 16. He actually ended up dying in 2017, unfortunately. In this picture, he's 86 years old, right? Hard to believe. This guy was just a bundle of energy. But he was actually the first president of Africa to take his job peacefully, right? Say that again, the first president of an African country to take his job peacefully. And so it was really cool. There was some ACM students that I was there with. We all got a chance to spend some time with him. He was a really kind of an amazing guy. But, you know, the fact that you know, you can count on one hand the number of leaders of Africa that have taken power peacefully tells you a lot about what's been wrong with Africa over the last 100 years or so, right? Is that they just don't have a lot of quality political institutions, which lead to bad economic institutions, which has significantly impacted growth. And so why is Botswana different? Botswana has a per capita GDP of about $20,000 a person, which is by far the richest in Africa. Just to compare it to its neighbor, Zimbabwe.
Can I share a screen?
Yes, thank you. Compared to its neighbor, Zimbabwe, I believe, I should have checked this. So this sharing? So are you seeing my screen? Let me try this again. Are you guys seeing my writing screen? There it goes. Okay, there's something funky going on there. So you compare this to Zimbabwe, which is about $1,500 a person, right? Botswana is quite a success story. Okay. And so the question here is why? And there's a number of things that kind of factor in. Okay, there's a number of things that factor in. And so let's kind of talk about this. Botswana had a different colonization history. Botswana was not colonized in the same way that most other African countries were colonized. And so I don't know to what extent most of you are familiar with African history, but basically the British colonized a lot of Southern Africa, right? And when they did, they basically treated it as an extractive possibility, right? For diamonds or other natural resources. This happened in South Africa, and it also happened in Rhodesia, right? Rhodesia is what Zimbabwe was called when it was a colony. And in fact, Rhodesia is named after Cecil Rhodes, who is also the person by which we call Rhodes Scholars. If you're familiar with Rhodes Scholars are Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was one of the greatest villains in history, right? A man that aggressively tried to colonize as much of Africa as he could and turn it into a very extractive opportunity, right? In which you basically forced people into labor, you gave them very little political and economic freedom, and then you kind of took the benefits, right? Took the benefits. And so oftentimes in Rhodesia, in South Africa, white settlers were given all the privileges of ownership of political institutions, and that most of the institutions, the productive institutions, were excluded from Black people. Also, people of color were forced not to live in cities, but to live in townships, where basically they were hoarded in one area, right? So I think the first day of class, I showed you pictures of Soweto, right? That's how a lot of South Africa and current Zimbabwe was organized back in the 1950s and the 1960s. But not Botswana, right? Botswana was a protectorate, not a colony. And what that means is they got colonization light. They had a relatively light form of colonization in which Botswana was largely left to itself. And why? Why is because the British and Cecil Rhodes didn't see any value in Botswana. As we talked about, it was largely a semi-arid desert, not suitable for massive farming. There were no observable natural resources. And so as a result, it was basically left to itself. And so I showed you the statue of the three chiefs. The three chiefs are three of the chiefs of the larger tribes in Botswana. And in 1895, they went to England and talked to Queen Elizabeth and encouraged her to leave Botswana as a protectorate, to not have a formal colonization structure, but to kind of leave Botswana as it is. And so, unlike in many other countries, right? Pre-colonial institutions in Botswana continue to exist. In other places, the British came in and just, basically cleaned the table, right? Got rid of all of their, the tribal structures, their legal systems. Many of these were kind of informal legal systems, but they'd operated over years. Their method of managing land and property rights, all of it just kind of wiped out. And they say, well, you're going to use the British system. And often the British system highly favored whites as opposed to people of color. That didn't really happen in Botswana, right? Botswana really kind of, were able to continue with their pre-colonial institutions. But that wouldn't have been great if it had bad pre-colonial institutions. The interesting thing about Botswana was Botswana had inclusive pre-colonial institutions. Botswana's institutions were fairly inclusive. In other words, fairly productive. Right? Traditional societies organized around tribes and chiefs, but the chief's power was limited. In fact, every tribe has what are called hotlas. The K is pronounced like an H, hotlas. And hotlas are essentially like town halls. And so chiefs had to kind of stand up in front of the people and explain what they were doing. And if the people didn't like it, you could actually kick a chief out. So it wasn't democracy, right? Chiefs in general were hereditary. It doesn't mean that chiefs had this kind of unlimited power to do whatever they want. So this is actually kind of a semi-democratic system, strangely enough, that Botswana had, has had for, hundreds and hundreds of years. They had a functioning tribal legal system where the chief often serves as essentially a judge. And continues to exist to this day in Botswana, right? If you want to get a divorce or if you sue somebody, you can, there is a formal legal system, but there's also a tribal legal system. And you can just take it to the tribal legal system and have it settled the old-fashioned way. And many people in Botswana are just fine with that. That works with them. It works for what they expect, right? And one of the really important things is that there was a system of protecting property rights. Because the most common job in Botswana was grazing cattle, right? And so what this means is that people had to share land, but there were very strict laws about how many cattle you had, how you share land, who gets access to it. A lot of these are very informal, but they actually work pretty well. When Botswana became independent, the elites, and by that I mean the tribal leaders, the people that were rich, the few people who had a Western education, their interests were not in stealing money from people, but in actually maintaining property rights. Part of this was because pretty much everybody in the country owned cattle, right? And so I don't know if any of you come from farming families, but you know, when you're a farmer or you're a herder or whatever, you know, protecting the rights of your property is very, very important. And so even the elites, in many ways, the elites' interests were not that much different from the poor people's interests, right? Everybody in some way, shape, or form was a cattle owner. And so they had interest in protecting private property, right? So to give you a sense, though, of how poor a place Botswana was at independence, at independence, Botswana had 12 kilometers of paved roads. 12 kilometers in the entire country, a country the size of Texas. Why did they have those 12 kilometers? Because the Queen came and visited. And so they actually paved the road, the Britons paved the road from the airport to basically, you know, the capital. But that's it, right? That's it, 12 kilometers in a country the size of Texas. They had 22 university graduates in the entire country of 3 million people. They had 100 high school graduates in the entire country in 1966. And they were surrounded by hostile neighbors, countries that were white dominated. Namibia, South Africa, Rhodesia. How in the world did Botswana navigate this, okay? Well, partly they had good institutions, and those institutions were allowed to continue. What number are we on? But in part, the importance of leadership. One of the things that Acemoglu and Johnson emphasized throughout this book is that history is random, and to some extent, being rich is often the product of luck. Quite simply, you cannot discount the role of random good luck and bad luck when it comes to whether some countries are rich and some countries are poor. And as we're going to talk about, Botswana had some really good luck, right? One of the ways they had really good luck is they had really good leadership. And a lot of that is in the form of their first president, Seretse Khama. So Khama has had a really interesting life. In fact, if any of you interested in Botswana or whatever, there was a movie a couple of years ago about his life called A United Kingdom. I think it's a 2016 movie about the life of Seretse Khama. So here is Khama's life in brief. He was the son of a chief. So in other words, he was destined to be a chief of actually the biggest tribe in Botswana. He actually studied in England. So he was one of the 22 people who had a college graduate education. When he was in England, he fell in love with a white woman and he married her. After he married her, he was banned from coming back to Botswana. At that time, it was called Buchanan, okay, by the apartheid government in South Africa. So basically, the Brits wouldn't let him go back to Botswana because they were worried about pissing off the apartheid government in South Africa. So he was kind of locked in England. He eventually came back when Botswana became independent and was voted to be the first president. And so one of the things that Khama did was, unlike what we see in most of other Africa, he created a non-racial state. Right? As I said, his wife was white. And while there were very few white people in Botswana, he purposely tried to set up the institutions that were race neutral, unlike almost every other country in Africa, right, where race was an important part of the institutions. He tried to avoid that. He created a strong central government. In part because of the power of his leadership, right? And you just can't, I don't know what to say other than he was their George Washington, right? Could the U.S. turned out different if we had somebody other than George Washington? Of course it could have. And the same for Botswana, right? By providing strong leadership, he did. What does strong leadership look like? Or let me put it this way. Is a strong central government a good thing? Well, this is an idea that has been debated among philosophers, political economists for years about how strong a central government should be. And so this is actually an idea that goes all the way back to the 1700s. Where Hobbes talked about the Leviathan. So you might be familiar with Thomas Hobbes. He's, political philosopher. He was the person who kind of thought that without government, we would just have chaos, right? And so what his idea was, what we need is government needs to act like a leviathan. And what's a leviathan? Well, here's a picture that was first accompanied Hobbes's book. The leviathan is a monster, okay? Leviathan is a monster. So here's a picture of the monster. And you can see who makes the monster. If you can see the shirt or what the monster is, it's made up of people, right? The government. The government is a monster. What you need, though, is you need a monster that's strong enough to keep everybody in line, but not so strong that it eats everybody. And that's basically Hobbes's theory of government, right? You cannot have an absent Leviathan, but you can't have a despotic Leviathan either. So every country needs to find a balance between what we'll call the absent Leviathan, where it's just chaos. Everybody does what they want. People killing each other, right? It's anarchy. Versus the despotic Leviathan. In other words, the Leviathan that becomes an autocrat and eats everyone. This is where Goldilocks institutions come from. Goldilocks means not too hot, not too cold. You need a strong central government, but you can't have it too strong. If you have it too strong, it's just going to eat you. Right? Sometimes your authors refer to this as the shackled Leviathan. Right? The Leviathan, oops, I forgot an L in there. Shackled Leviathan, right? The Leviathan that's strong, but you have it under control, right? You have it under control. And so, you know, if you look, a lot of this story that Acemoglu and Robinson tell in this book is that when you look at countries that fail, it's because they don't get this balance right. The government either gets too strong or it's too weak. And so you need to kind of find a way to get it in the right area, right? So, for instance, they show this photo or this graph. Can I find it? Sorry. Okay, so here's the graph. You think about the power of society on the horizontal axis, right? Basically, more power to the people. And then on the vertical axis, you have the power of the state or the elites. What you have to do is you have to find some sort of balance between the power of the people and the power of elites. And where is the shackled Leviathan? It's in the middle. It tries to balance the power of individuals versus the power of elites. But what can happen is you can get off the path, right? You can get off the path. Sometimes that Leviathan can get too strong and it begins to inhibit growth. And in Acemoglu Johnson's opinion, China is an example of that, right? A state that is too strong, that is too controlling. And so it begins to squash markets, it begins to squash ideas, right? Or you can have a state that's too weak. He has the TIV here. This is a group of people in Congo. But that's exactly what happens in the Congo, right? They have no state. no functioning state. And so really it's everybody for themselves. And so what you need to do is you need to find some way to balance these. And so Botswana has done it, and countries that are rich have done it. But other countries have not, right? Other countries have not been able to do that. Okay, really quickly here, just to finish or talk about Botswana, I'll just go through my last couple of points quickly, because I know we're at the end of our time. Botswana was lucky in another way, though. They didn't just have good leadership. Botswana found diamonds. And when did they find them? After independence. If diamonds would have been discovered in Botswana while they were a colony, there's no doubt Botswana would have turned out different. And I'm going to put here found, because there's good evidence to suggest that lots of people knew in Botswana that they had diamonds. The only people who didn't know were the British. Right? And so it was a pretty good job of keeping a very important secret. And so the fact that Botswana had good institutions and then found diamonds meant that the resources were distributed widely, not just to elites. And so here's another example of where comma was absolutely crucial. It just just so happens that Khama, who I told you was a chief, diamonds, the main diamond lode was discovered in land that was controlled by his tribe. So if he was like most African leaders, he would have said, all of these diamonds are for me and my people. You guys do something else. But instead, Khama said, no, these diamonds should be enjoyed by all of the people in Botswana. And so that, set an important precedent, right? That the resources were distributed widely. And, we're going to come back and talk later about something called the resource curse. But there is such a thing as a resource curse, that having resources can actually be more of a hindrance than a help. Because what does it do? It creates incentives for people to just essentially extract, to pillage. It creates a lot of incentive to pillage. It creates a lot of incentive for war and conflict. And if you have resources in a country that can't handle that, resources may not encourage growth. They might actually discourage growth. Right. The last thing that works about in Botswana is that the things that we teach you in macro classes, right? All the things that you learned in principles and intermediate, they actually work. We haven't been feeding you a line of bullshit. One of the reasons that Botswana works is it basically has followed good policy, right? It's kept low inflation, low government debt. It hasn't borrowed like crazy. It saves a good portion of its diamond reserves for, downturns. It's gradually built up other industries to diversify, such as tourism. I don't want to get carried away here. Botswana is not a diverse economy, right? It is not a diverse economy at all. I mean, still it is true today that the biggest forms of government, or the biggest jobs are, you raise cattle, you work in tourism, or you work for the government, right? And that is a problem, right? 40% of the people work for the government. The diamond mines actually don't employ a lot of people. They're very, very heavily industrialized. So they don't really employ a lot of people. Not many people work at mining diamonds. It's for those of you who play Minecraft, Minecraft is complete bullshit. Because I've been to a diamond mine, which is actually a fascinating experience, right? I've never been inspected so closely as I have been coming out of a diamond mine. But yeah, you know, at least in diamond mining in Botswana is deep pit deep pit mining. And so it's highly, highly mechanized. And so really not many people work there. And so, you know, the government ends up employing a lot of people. It's not a diverse economy. And, you know, in many ways, Botswana's got a lot of problems, right? Because without a diverse economy, you know, it's very vulnerable to downturns in meat prices, very vulnerable to downturns in tourism. And so this has been a tough couple of years for Botswana. But the story is that, you know, despite all those problems, Botswana looks a lot better than its neighbors. And in large part, it's because of their institutions, right? And so you can create good institutions and you can create bad ones. And so that's the story of the case studies in the rest of this chapter, from the Congo. I think the institutions of the US South is really kind of an interesting read, of China, right? Those are, I think, interesting. I'm just not going to spend time talking about them, but I think you can read those for yourself and kind of understand why institutions sometimes work and sometimes they don't. Okay, I'm going a little bit late, so we're going to cut this off. So this afternoon, I actually got through this morning what I wanted to talk about. So I'm not going to have formal class this afternoon. I will basically be here at 12:30, right? And you can come, and if you want to have some questions about the exam or ask some questions, I'll be here. And if you don't feel that's a good use of your time, if you want to spend your own time studying, don't show up. I'll hang out until there's nobody here to ask questions. If 12:30 doesn't work for you, you can also send me an email, and we could also Zoom. I have a couple of meetings this afternoon, but I'm sure we could probably find some time around those. So anyway, show up at 12:30 if you want to kind of participate in office hours, but it's not mandatory in any way. If you time would be better spent studying for the exam tomorrow, please do it. So sound good? Okay, so I may not actually see your faces tomorrow, but be looking, if I don't see you this afternoon, be looking for that email at 9 o'clock. And remember, you got to send your exam back to me by noon, right? Central Standard Time. Okay? All right, everybody. Have a good one.